The sources you have shared with us pose, I think, one of the most frustrating and just foundational questions in the history of statecraft. How can a supreme document, a nation's very first constitution, not only fail, but collapse so spectacularly, so quickly? I mean, it was swept away by martial law just 2 years after it was adopted. 2 years.
It's a question that really forces you to look beyond the usual mechanics of governance.
Yeah.
Normally, when a constitution fails, our first assumption is a technical one. Maybe the judicial review was too weak or the legislature was too fragmented, something in the design.
A flaw in the blueprint.
Exactly. But the material we're diving into today suggests the cause was much, much more fundamental and, frankly, much more moral.
Right, exactly. We are undertaking a deep dive into Pakistan's first great constitutional tragedy, the swift, systemic destruction of the 1956 Constitution. And this isn't just, a dusty history lesson. It's a masterclass in how a political culture can actively sabotage the very institutions meant to govern it.
And the core of our analysis is drawn from a really powerful scholarly work, Quaid-e-Azam of Pakistan. It's written by Zahir Ahmad Mir, who is a constitutional and corporate lawyer. The source material describes him as a vital contemporary voice dedicated to defending the true legacy of the state's founder, Muhammad Ali Jinnah.
So our mission today, then, is to really unpack the author's singular and I think very powerful thesis. Mir argues that the failure was not a defect in the document's legal text. It was a fatal flaw in the moral foundation of the political system, the character required to make that constitution actually work. It had been systematically eroded in the decade leading up to its adoption.
We absolutely have to frame this entire conversation around the author's primary revelation. The spirit, the discipline, the collective political character that's needed to uphold the supreme law, it was already missing. It was already compromised the moment that Constitution was enacted in 1956. So this document, which was meant to be a robust legal framework, was essentially born into an environment that had zero capacity for constitutional loyalty, zero capacity for discipline.
That sets a profoundly dark stage. Let's dive right into that timeline. Because, as you said, that delay itself, it's the first symptom of the disease, isn't it? The delay between independence in 1947 and the adoption of the first formal constitution in 1956, that's almost a decade, 9 years. In the life of a new nation, that time is absolutely critical. It's where your political habits are formed. So according to the source, why is that specific 9-year delay so incredibly significant?
Well, that gap isn't just some administrative lag. It's a political vacuum. And, nature abhors a vacuum. While the constituent assembly was struggling to find consensus on these huge foundational issues like federalism, representation, the role of Islam in the state,
The
big difficult questions. While they were doing that, the political elite were left operating without any firm, supreme legal boundaries. And in that kind of environment, the source notes, political opportunism, it just becomes the rule, not the exception. Bad habits, they don't just happen. They become institutionalized. They become procedures.
So by the time 1956 finally rolls around, the world is expecting some stability, and the nation desperately needs it. But the source is suggesting the foundational morality had already crumbled. What was the actual mechanism of failure here? How did it work?
It's encapsulated perfectly in the author's crucial, really powerful claim. He says, a constitution built on broken character cannot produce a functioning state. And that one insight, it shifts the entire focus away from the technical drafting table, and it puts it squarely on the moral compass of the people holding power. When the text arrived, it was, to use an analogy, a superior piece of software trying to run on completely broken, corrupted hardware.
I think that's an essential distinction and one we really need to spend some time on, because if we look at constitutional stability purely as a legal problem, we miss the entire point. Mir is arguing it's fundamentally an ethical problem. So what specifically were those moral ingredients that were just absent in the political leadership by 1956?
The source identifies 3 interlocking moral failures. First, the absence of constitutional morality. Second, a complete lack of political discipline. And third, a profound deficit of integrity. These 3 things, they are the silent guardians of any successful constitutional system.
Okay, let's start with constitutional morality. It's maybe the most abstract, but it also feels like the most vital. We need to define it clearly and show how its absence really manifested in that 9-year vacuum.
Right. So constitutional morality it's much more than just sticking to the letter of the law. It's that unwritten code, that spirit that demands you adhere to the spirit of the foundational document. Even, and this is the key part, especially when that adherence is politically costly or personally inconvenient.
Ah.
It means you accept an institutional defeat gracefully. You respect the defined roles of the separate branches of government, and you prioritize the long-term abstract health of the system over the short-term concrete political gain of your party or your faction.
So, if a leader lacks constitutional morality, they're always going to be looking for loopholes. They'll use some ambiguity in existing temporary laws to dissolve an assembly or to seize executive power, even if the spirit of democratic rule is clearly being violated. Which means the constitutional text itself is basically meaningless if the political will to uphold its ethics is gone.
Precisely. And in that 1947 to 1956 period, the absence of this spirit was visible everywhere. You just have to look at the sheer instability of governments. Prime ministers were changing with alarming frequency, and this was often due to political maneuvering and the misuse of executive and ceremonial powers. Things like the Governor General's power to dissolve the assembly, these were stretched far beyond their original intended constitutional boundaries.
And that establishes a precedent, a legal precedent for political instability long before 1956.
It does. That abuse of authority creates a toxic precedent. Every successful power grab just makes the next one that much easier because it legitimizes the use of non-constitutional means to achieve political ends.
And that's where discipline comes in, the second point.
That's where discipline comes in. Yes, discipline is all about procedural rigor. It means following the mandated rules, respecting institutional timelines, and ensuring that parliamentary and judicial processes function without partisan interference. The source notes that by 1956, this procedural discipline was simply non-existent. Votes were rigged, legislators were being bought and sold, and necessary constitutional processes like holding timely elections were perpetually delayed.
I can see the chain reaction there. If you don't have the constitutional morality, you look for a loophole. If you don't have the discipline, you just bypass the procedures entirely, which leads to legislative gridlock, to chaos. And the third missing element, integrity, it feels like it ties the first two together.
It does. Integrity is the simple but profound requirement of honesty in public office. It's a genuine commitment to public service and a complete avoidance of corruption or self-enrichment. When a leadership class lacks integrity, the national project just collapses into a series of opportunities for personal gain. I mean, why would a leader uphold a constitution that restricts their ability to enrich themselves or their cronies?
They wouldn't.
They wouldn't.
So when Mir concludes that the character of the governing class must precede the effectiveness of the document, he's saying the ethical framework is the prerequisite. It has to come first. If the political players who are tasked with enforcing the supreme law are corrupt, if they're undisciplined and morally cynical, the law itself is, well, it's just an expensive piece of paper.
It becomes completely irrelevant. The collapse of political character during those 9 years created a system that was fundamentally resistant to the introduction of a supreme law. It was poisoned at the well, long before the 1956 Constitution was formally published. The political class had already made a decision. They decided that individual ambition and factional survival superseded any national law.
That makes the Constitution's failure sound tragically inevitable. It wasn't a document failure at all. It was a societal and a political moral failure that just manifested through the document. Okay, so segment 1 established that moral vacuum. Now, let's drill down into the clinical symptoms of the infection itself. The political environment between the 1948 and 1956, the source emphasizes, was characterized by political self-destruction. It created an impossible breeding ground for constitutionalism.
It was actively corrosive, that era. We are talking about a time when the leadership was just consuming its own energy. It was constant, vicious internal warfare. The source lists the specific political ills that define this environment: intense power struggles, internal rivalries, shifting factional alliances, purely selfish leadership, and relentless personal vendettas.
And these aren't abstract concepts, are they? These are the political scars that define governance at the time. What's fascinating is how these constant self-serving activities fundamentally altered the way politicians viewed their ultimate duty, which was the creation of the foundational law.
It completely redefined the entire relationship between law and the state. For the politicians of that era, the Constitution, it ceased to be a national covenant. You know, that sacred unifying document that binds the state to its citizens and to future generations. Instead, it was just reduced to a tool for personal advantage.
Let's explore that difference because it's huge. A covenant is based on faith, on a shared identity, on mutual long-term loyalty. If you breach a covenant, you're violating a moral trust.
Exactly. A national covenant requires leaders to suppress their immediate personal desires for the sake of the collective, future good. But a tool for personal advantage, that's purely transactional. You use it to defeat your rivals, use it to extend your term or to access resources, and once it stops being useful, or once a better, sharper tool emerges, say, a military decree, it's disposable. If the political class only sees the Constitution as a weapon, they have no incentive to make it stable, transparent, or resilient.
And that profound shift in priority is perhaps the deepest root of this whole tragedy. And it brings us directly to the author's synthesis, which highlights this critical difference between state building and self-interest. The source quotes, "Instead of forming a constitution, leaders were forming governments. Instead of building a system, they were building alliances."
And this is the ultimate indictment of that leadership generation. When you are forming a constitution, you are engaging in strategic, principled, long-term thinking. You are discussing fundamental rights, the permanent structure of separation of powers, the mechanisms of accountability that will govern your great-grandchildren. It demands patience. It demands abstract loyalty.
But when you are merely forming governments, as they were doing, the focus is entirely tactical. Who can I ally with today to survive the next no-confidence motion? Which politician's ego do I need to soothe with a ministerial portfolio? The focus just shifts from that abstract constitutional architecture to immediate political logistics and tactical maneuvering.
And forming alliances is inherently fleeting. Alliances are transactional networks built on quid pro quo. They last only as long as the mutual self-interest holds. So when the leaders spent 9 years perfecting the art of building and destroying these alliances, they became, in a way, constitutionally illiterate. They didn't know how to build a robust, durable system, a set of rules that outlives any single faction or politician.
So the political energy was just completely consumed by this internal maneuvering. I mean, if you have 5 governments in 6 years, the bureaucracy is focused on serving the new master, not upholding a permanent law. There's no institutional memory, and there's certainly no energy left for true nation building.
And this chronic state of crisis meant that when the 1956 Constitution finally arrived, it didn't stabilize the environment at all. It simply became another bigger arena for those same existing rivalries. The leaders were already adept at skirting political norms, operating outside the bounds of discipline, and viewing the national project solely through the lens of their own grudges or ambitions. This moral bankruptcy ensured the document was doomed from its very inception. It was doomed because the people who were supposed to be its champions were actually its most enthusiastic saboteurs.
It's a very compelling argument. The state's foundations were compromised, and the political culture was terminal before the Constitution was even written. The document arrived, but the required scaffolding of moral trust had already been dismantled.
And we can see the consequences of this immediate instability. Even in the practical matters of state, the constant cabinet reshuffles, the delays in basic planning, the erosion of administrative efficiency, all of it stems from the central prioritization of personal ambition over national duty. The failure of character wasn't just theoretical. It manifested as deep institutional chaos, which weakened the state's ability to function and made it incredibly vulnerable to non-political intervention.
So now we move from the moral disease itself to its impact on the actual constitutional crafting process. When we think of founding fathers writing a constitution, we picture these principled debates and high philosophy. The source, however, paints a very vivid picture of the 1956 Constitution being formed not in a climate of principled discussion, but through high-stakes transactional negotiation.
The idealism was largely absent. The 1956 Constitution, according to Mir, was essentially a political armistice, a ceasefire. It was a product of urgent compromise, intense regional bargaining, and pure, unadulterated political pressure. It was the necessity of getting something passed to satisfy the growing national demand for a formal structure.
So instead of a national blueprint rooted in some kind of philosophical unity, it became a balance sheet of temporary political gains. Let's look at the specific constitutional issues that were traded, the pillars of the state that were subject to haggling rather than principled resolution.
Right, and these issues were the absolute bedrock of the new republic, yet they were treated like commodities up for trade. You had the crucial balance of central versus provincial powers, the incredibly sensitive parity arrangements between East and West Pakistan, the structure and powers of the executive branch, the complex design of the electoral systems, and, of course, the incorporation of the necessary Islamic clauses.
Let's focus on the parity arrangements for a second, because they really highlight the transactional nature of this whole document. East Pakistan had a larger population, but the Constitution established parity equal representation for the two wings. This was done to appease the smaller but politically dominant West Wing elite.
That's a perfect example of trading principle for expediency. The technical resolution of parity was complex, yes, but it was driven by an urgent need to overcome a political impasse. It was a mathematical deal, a way to satisfy the competing regional elites right now, rather than a solution arrived at through a deep moral acceptance of fairness or democratic equality. And when you resolve such a fundamental issue through political necessity, the solution has no inherent moral sanctity.
Which means the second the alignment of political forces changes, the aggrieved party has no constitutional loyalty to uphold that arrangement, because they know it was forced on them in the first place as a condition of passage.
Precisely. When constitutional issues are traded, their value is determined by the shifting power dynamics of the current political coalition, not by their long-term systemic stability. The political class was focused on getting enough votes to pass the document, not on ensuring that the resulting clauses were robust enough to withstand future political stress.
And this leads right to the author's critical observation. The Constitution became a political agreement, not a national blueprint. That distinction feels like the death knell of the 1956 document.
It is. A political agreement is transient. It is inherently unstable because it's based on the temporary distribution of power. If the coalition collapses, the agreement is null and void. The leaders who wrote it saw it as a temporary truce in their ongoing power struggle. Why would they remain loyal to a truth they themselves established under duress?
Right. And you contrast that with a blueprint. A national blueprint implies a vision that transcends the current government. It's future-oriented. It aims for permanence. It requires a stability of purpose that bargaining inherently lacks. And I imagine the process of political bargaining introduces ambiguity and compromise into the text itself.
Absolutely. The need for compromise meant that certain vital clauses had to be deliberately ambiguous. This was done to satisfy multiple, often conflicting political groups at the same time. This lack of clarity is disastrous for the rule of law. Ambiguity is an open invitation for future politicians to interpret the law entirely to their advantage, which leads right back to that constitutional morality deficit we discussed earlier.
So the seeds of the 1958 destruction were sown in the very compromises that allowed for the 1956 adoption. Every trade-off became a structural weak point, just waiting for the political pressure to rise and exploit it. They mistook a fragile, temporary consensus among elites for constitutional finality and for public acceptance.
And this also explains the lack of national unity around the document. If the Constitution is perceived by the populace as nothing more than a backroom deal among squabbling politicians, the populace won't rise up to defend it when it's threatened. In 1958, they weren't overturning a sacred covenant. They were, as you said, simply canceling a flawed trade deal that had no deep-seated national commitment behind it. The process itself betrayed the very idea of supreme law.
To truly gauge the extent of this moral and structural deviation, we have to compare the 1956 result with the principles that were established by the founder, Quaid Jinnah. This segment is about the specific constitutional and ethical principles Jinnah laid out that the succeeding political leadership either ignored or actively diluted. This provides the context for why the new document just lacked the necessary integrity.
Jinnah's framework wasn't just legal. It was deeply ethical. It was designed to ensure the survival and stability of a very diverse state. The source outlines his core tenets, which the 1956 document either watered down or just failed to enforce because of the surrounding political environment. These principles include the supremacy of law, merit-based administration, equal citizenship and minority protection, economic justice, moral leadership, and Islamic principles of fairness and accountability.
That is a very comprehensive vision for a modern, equitable state. Let's break down how those 9 years of political self-interest actively dismantled these 6 pillars, starting with the supremacy of law.
Supremacy of law means the law is the ultimate sovereign. It restricts everyone, especially the executive. However, the period leading up to 1956 was marked by the pervasive use of extra-constitutional, or let's say ambiguously constitutional powers by the Governor General and executive leaders. They used these powers to dissolve assemblies and dismiss governments at will. This established a political reality where individuals believed they were above the law if they could just muster enough political or institutional force. They actively taught the country, through their actions, that the law was a tool, not a master.
And this ties directly into the destruction of merit-based administration. In a functioning constitutional system, the civil service has to be competent and politically neutral to ensure laws are applied fairly. But if your political system is defined by factional alliances and transactional governance, what happens to merit?
Merit is replaced wholesale by patronage. It's that simple. If leaders are building these fragile alliances like we talked about, they have to reward loyalty over competence to ensure their political survival. So they stack the administration, the very machinery of the state, with weak, politically expedient individuals. And this process of hollowing out the bureaucracy means that even if the 1956 Constitution had been perfect, the institutions responsible for implementing it, the police, the tax agencies, the civil services, they were too compromised and inefficient to function effectively. Institutional capacity was deliberately traded away for political stability.
That is a devastating long-term consequence. By prioritizing short-term patronage, they crippled the state's capacity to govern justly, which makes any constitutional promise of economic or social justice basically impossible to deliver.
And this institutional weakness directly undermines Jinnah's emphasis on equal citizenship and minority protection. When institutions are politicized and corrupt, they cannot treat all citizens equally. It's impossible. Justice becomes something negotiated through political influence rather than secured by law. So if significant segments of the population, especially minorities, see that the constitutional promises of equality are just ignored in practice, they lose their commitment to the state's foundational document. The covenant fractures.
That sense of betrayal weakens the national fabric, making the state less resilient against any crisis. Now let's look at the more ethical principles: economic justice and moral leadership.
These two are inseparable. Jinnah envisioned a leadership that governed with moral rectitude, ensuring the state functioned for the upliftment of all citizens, particularly the poor, not for the self-enrichment of a tiny elite. The 1948-1956 environment was the complete opposite. A lack of morality meant that economic policy was often filtered through the lens of corruption, self-interest, and elite gain. The transactional nature of constitution-making that we talked about, it inherently lacked the moral direction required to embed principles of economic justice firmly into the system. It prioritized political survival over societal well-being.
And the final principle, Islamic principles of fairness and accountability, that also reinforces this character argument. It suggests that even the religious ideals that were meant to guide the nation were focused on ethics and justice, not just on formality.
Exactly. The source notes that the ethical component, the focus on a dab on justice and accountability, it was diluted into mere formalistic clauses within the 1956 text. It became political window dressing rather than a guiding moral force. The political class used religion as a bargaining chip, not as a source of ethical restraint on their own power.
So if we weigh the deficiencies of the 1956 text against this really rigorous blueprint from Jinnah, the flaws become just abundantly clear. It lacked clarity because it was negotiated, it lacked moral direction because the leaders were immoral, and it lacked executive discipline because the executive had spent 9 years perfecting overreach.
And this culminates in the author's ultimate devastating indictment. Pakistan tried to write a constitution without following the man who created the state. This was the foundation of its failure. They rejected the architectural specifications for stability, opting instead for a ramshackle political shed built on shifting sands.
It raises a profound question for you, the learner. Was failure not only inevitable, but actually guaranteed once the political class willfully chose to abandon the clear ethical framework laid out by the founder in favor of petty rivalry and self-interest? The moral framework was lost, and the constitutional framework was immediately compromised.
The answer the source provides is a resounding yes. The political class, having established its own toxic internal culture, was fundamentally incompatible with the principles of robust constitutional governance. They'd cultivated a culture where supreme law was optional, making the ensuing collapse a mere formality, just waiting for the right external pressure.
And now we arrive at the tragic climax, the collapse. The 1956 Constitution was adopted in March 1956 and then swept aside by martial law in October 1958, a lifespan of just 30 months. That brevity is terrifying. It shows how utterly hollow the constitutional foundation had become.
It signals a complete lack of resilience. The period from 56 to 58 was not a slow decay. It was a rapid system failure, fueled by the pre-existing disease we've been chronicling. The Constitution was simply unable to resist the first significant political stress test it faced.
What were the proximate causes of martial law, then? The immediate triggers that are cited in the source. Crucially, they weren't deep legal flaws in the text itself, but the terminal condition of the implementing institution.
Right. The source lists the critical, immediate failures: weak institutions, divided leadership, a profound absence of morality, a compromised judiciary, and non-existent constitutional discipline.
Okay, let's analyze these in their final moments. Weak institutions were the direct consequence of years of patronage replacing merit. By 1958, state bodies, from the civil administration to election commissions, they were filled with political loyalists who lacked the competence or the moral courage to resist executive pressure. They were just incapable of standing up for the Constitution.
And the divided leadership ensured there was no unified political will to defend the document. Leaders were so busy fighting each other, using parliamentary tricks and leveraging their fragile majorities for personal gain, that when the external threat of the military materialized, there was no political front capable of uniting to protect the system. They valued defeating their rivals more than they valued saving the constitutional structure.
The compromised judiciary is perhaps the most heartbreaking element of those proximate causes. I mean, the judiciary is supposed to be the final guardian, the body that holds the executive accountable. What did its compromise look like in practice during this period?
Judicial compromise meant that rather than ruling against politically motivated executive overreach, the courts began to find legal justifications for what were clearly unconstitutional actions. This effectively gave a veneer of legality to the political chaos. And when the judiciary ceases to be an independent interpreter of law and becomes a ratifier of political power, the rule of law is dead in practice. The military intervention became that much easier because the civilian legal system had already failed to check the power of the ruling elite.
So by 1958, the leaders were undisciplined, the institutions were weak, and the legal guardrails were just down. The formal constitutional discipline had utterly vanished. The system was functionally chaotic, ripe for an intervention promising order.
And this brings us to the most defining conclusion, the author's powerful final verdict on the 1956 tragedy, which really sums up the decade of political self-destruction. The 1956 Constitution did not collapse. It was never allowed to stand.
That statement is devastating because it suggests the Constitution wasn't even given a chance to fail organically. It was essentially killed the moment it was conceived by the very political culture that drafted it.
It was a stillborn document. It was strangled by the ambition and self-interest of its supposed creators. The political class simply continued the pattern of rivalry and self-interest that had defined the preceding 9 years. They treated the Constitution as temporary scaffolding until they could find an excuse, or a willing partner, to usher in a system more favorable to their interests. The martial law merely formalized a state of constitutional death that has existed politically and morally for years.
The ultimate unforgettable takeaway for the learner has to be this. The failure was not a technical flaw like a badly structured clause on revenue distribution. It was the complete, utter failure of the political character meant to protect and uphold the text. The individuals charged with breathing life into the Constitution instead systematically suffocated it.
We have to hold on to that distinction. A constitution is inert without the commitment of the political actors. It is only as strong as the moral character, the integrity, and the discipline of those who swear to uphold it. When that character is absent, the text is a disposable artifact, easily ripped up by any powerful force that recognizes the fundamental hollowness beneath the legal facade.
So this deep dive has explored Pakistan's first great attempt at constitutional government and, well, its subsequent tragedy. We've used the scholarly framework provided by Zahir Ahmad Mir to understand that the political culture, by prioritizing personal gain and factional alliances, ultimately rendered the 1956 Constitution completely unsustainable.
Yeah, the analysis clearly demonstrates that the failure was rooted in a pre-existing moral bankruptcy, and that allowed the document to be seen as a temporary political trade deal rather than a sacred, long-term national blueprint. The prolonged delay in its creation was the incubator for the political diseases that proved terminal.
The core lesson here, and it's one that transcends this particular historical event, is that a constitution cannot protect a country when its leaders refuse to protect the spirit and the integrity of that constitution. The text is always vulnerable when the core moral values of integrity and discipline are missing from the executive, legislative, and even judicial branches.
And the author's work points directly toward the future. The source material argues that stability in Pakistan requires nothing less than the return of Jinnah's moral, constitutional, and ethical discipline. This implies that the solution for future stability is not solely about rewriting laws. It's the far, far harder task of fundamentally reforming the political character itself. It requires an ethical renewal mirroring the founder's original vision.
And that is the perpetual challenge facing any state battling internal corruption and ambition. The failure of 1956 was the profound moral vacuum that immediately preceded and in a way justified the imposition of martial law just 2 years later.
And it raises a crucial, provocative closing thought for you, the learner, to consider. The Constitution was discarded because it had already been killed by neglect and self-interest. So if the political character failure of 1956 was the essential foundation for that, how rapidly does a state slide into non-democratic forms of governance when its supreme legal framework has been completely hollowed out from the inside? When the law becomes merely a political convenience, what truly stands in the way of the next powerful group deciding to tear up the agreement entirely? The political culture of disregard is always the precursor to the military boot.
A sobering and essential perspective on the relationship between morality and governance. We hope this deep dive into the political character flaws of 1956 has given you a robust framework for analyzing constitutional stability, both historically and in contemporary contexts.